Kosovo of last night's damage. And Francis, too, so what does it actually mean to you to see pictures? I mean, is it possible to actually distinguish what kind of damage is caused when you can only see flames in darkness, for example?
From this, without knowing which part of Pristina was hit, difficult to tell. We do know roughly which targets were hit, and if we could work out where the pictures are coming from, as we're north, south, east, west of Pristina itself, we might be able to match the stated targets with the photos we're seeing. But at the moment, we're still trying to put together this sort of matrix of grids and coordinates, and hopefully later...
The suggestion here is that this is a fuel dump alongside a military barracks.
It is certainly a fuel fire you're looking at, and in which case, if they've said they've gone after a fuel dump, that would seem to be quite good evidence they managed to get it. The issue, as I was saying earlier, is, well, if that's surrounded by civilian facilities anyway, bombs, the explosions spread, and let's hope there was not too much collateral damage, if any.
Now, what would you expect Javier Solana, the NATO Secretary-General, to say today? Because the big question surrounding all events related to this conflict now is how long is it going to last?
He will be asked that question, I have no doubt, bearing in mind from the press briefings yesterday from US Defense Secretary William Cohen and today's press briefing given by both the Secretary of State for Defence George Robertson and the Chief of the Defence Staff Sir Charles Guthrie. When asked that question, they've said it will go on as long as is needed. I will be surprised if Javier Solana gives a very different answer. I think that is the party line. I think he will probably be spending much more time saying how united NATO is, that you can't separate NATO. They are all agreed on this course of action. Here we are on NATO's 50th anniversary, just had 3 new members joining in the form of Poland, Czech Republic and Hungary. I think he's going to be trying to reinforce unity. Though the one to see is whether Wesley Clark, the US general who commands NATO forces, will give us an equivalent military briefing to that we saw from General Sir Charles Guthrie of the Ministry of Defence.
But they must be particularly surprised, or shocked even, these 3 new countries that have just joined, to join what is effectively a NATO organisation that's in for peace only. Here they are on the offensive for the first time.
I have no doubt that in some of the 3 new member countries there will be more and more voices saying, are you sure we've not made a mistake? Although in places like Poland, joining NATO was generally universally regarded as good, in both the Czech Republic and Hungary there were sizable minorities who were against the idea, and events like this, which is seen as an offensive action, might get them back up saying, what have we done?
We were talking about how the reconnaissance pictures will still be dissected at the moment, although we're expecting a statement about that, and about how in the various bases aircraft have rearmed. Some information here that 6 F-16 fighter planes have taken off in rapid succession from Aviano in Italy, and they took off at intervals of about a minute, but obviously nobody at this stage saying where they're going and what they're doing. We can now see some action over in Brussels at the NATO briefing. Javier Solana approaching the stage.
Accompanied there by General Wesley Clark, in charge of the operations.
He's the military commander of NATO forces. It is traditional ever since the formation of NATO. It is always an American who's the head, and a British officer is the number 2.
Let's hear what they have to say.
And when they have given their briefings, both will be on hand to take your questions. Secretary General, please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. As you know, yesterday evening around 8 p.m., Operation Allied Force began. Last night's operation was carried out with broad participation of NATO allies, and I would like to emphasize that this demonstrates a NATO solidarity, unity, and resolve in carrying out these actions. Let me also stress that the strikes were conducted against carefully chosen military targets, focused basically on the air defense network of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. The initial report we have at this time indicates that these first strikes were successful. All NATO aircraft returned safely to their bases. I'd like to use this opportunity to thank, on behalf of the North Atlantic Council, all the men and all the women in our allied countries in the armed services who were involved in this operation. In a few moments, I will ask Kurt to give you an interim update on activities. But let me first of all reiterate that we are determined to continue until we have achieved our objectives, to halt the violence and to stop the further humanitarian catastrophe. I like to emphasize that we have no quarrel with the people of Yugoslavia. Our action is directed against the repressive policies of the Yugoslav government, which is refusing to respect civilized norms of behavior in this Europe at the end of the 20th century. The responsibility for the current crisis rests with President Milosevic. It is up to him to comply with the demands of the international community, and I strongly urge him to do so. Let me now turn to General Clark for his update.
Thank you, Secretary General. As the Secretary General said yesterday, we began Operation Allied Force. It's the first alliance-wide air operation of its type, taken in response to the deepening humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Kosovo as Yugoslav military and security forces continue and intensify their attacks on their own people. The purposes of this operation have been well articulated by the Secretary General, by the heads of state and government of many nations throughout the alliance. But the military mission is to attack Yugoslav military and security forces and associated facilities with sufficient effect to degrade their capacity to continue repression on the civilian populace and to deter further military and security actions against their own people. We aim to put his military and security forces at risk. We're going to systematically and progressively attack, disrupt, degrade, devastate, and ultimately, unless President Milosevic complies with the demands of the international community, we're going to destroy these forces and their facilities and support. In that respect, the operation will be just as long and difficult as President Milosevic requires it to be. As Secretary General Solana has said, this is not an attack against the Serb people. Every effort's being made to avoid harm to innocent civilians and to avoid collateral property damage. In the operation thus far, almost 400 aircraft and several warships have been involved, all different types from most nations in the alliance. Thus far, more than 40 targets have been struck. Most of these targets were associated with the integrated air defense system. Other targets included command and control facilities, some facilities associated more directly with the Yugoslav military and ministerial police forces, and a few military support facilities. To be very clear about this, what we're targeting are military and security forces and their associated facilities. We're doing everything we can in the targeting process to minimize collateral damages or casualties to people who are not involved. What we're targeting here are the military security forces and the associated facilities. We're taking all possible measures to minimize collateral damage, damage to innocent civilians or nearby property that's not associated with the target. We obviously want to have the maximum effect on their ability to prosecute these offensive operations against their own people and cause this humanitarian tragedy.
Does NATO have any plan how to defend the civilians now on the ground in Kosovo? Because there are some reports that the Serbian forces and paramilitary forces are burning the houses, kidnapping people and killing within the cities. And for General Clark, there are some reports also that the Yugoslav army is using MiG-29 to attack area of Podujevo. So will their aircraft be the target of your attack?
Well, let me answer your question saying that the purpose, or one of the purposes of this operation is to stop that from happening. And General Clark, I think, has explained that properly along the answering the question in his introductory remarks.
Yes, their aircraft are a target of our attacks.
With that, we go to the next question. Mrs. Savic, please.
Dubravka Savic, Novosti, Belgrade. For Secretary General, you mentioned that the objective of this attack is to stop repression and humanitarian catastrophe. Are you convinced that provoking a new humanitarian catastrophe is the right way to achieve this goal? And especially concerning ground troops. And for Mr. Clark, could you please comment on the proportion of these attacks? It seems to be 19 to 1 country.
With due respect, I'd like to say once again that the only person which is responsible for creating a humanitarian catastrophe has a name, and his name is President Milosevic, not NATO.
About Yugoslav people, not about president.
I said from the very beginning, that NATO is not waging a war against the Yugoslav people, to the contrary, to the Serbian people, to the contrary. I think I've given many proofs in the last years, in the last months, and today.
All right, that question has been answered, and I judge we go to the next question, which goes to Guido Vendoretti.
That the situation escalates in case that the Serbians go for massacres like they did in Bosnia. We cannot forget that they are capable of massacring people like they did in Drenica, 7,000 in one place. So we are afraid of that, people are afraid of that, although everybody supports this action. We have heard lots of reports, statements from people saying that Kosovo would be another Vietnam. It would not be another Vietnam because NATO countries have the support of 90% of the people on the ground. It would have been maybe another Vietnam if NATO went to Serbia and tried to occupy Serbia, but in this case, in Kosovo, they have the support of the people on the ground. So they cannot face any danger, even if they decide to have the ground troops in Kosovo.
But how are airstrikes going to help this terrible humanitarian situation?
Well, the airstrikes are meant to stop this humanitarian crisis. They are meant to inflict enough damage on the Serbian machinery so that they could come to the table and agree the agreement which was agreed by Albanians in Paris. And then NATO troops would walk in peacefully in Kosovo, and we would have an intermediate status of 3 years guaranteeing peace. NATO troops, we have to remember that NATO troops were not coming in there to protect just Albanians. NATO troops were coming in to protect everybody on the ground in Kosovo. And there is no desire on the Albanian side and on the Albanian people to do anything wrong against Serbs in Kosovo. We don't have anything, anything to do with, any problems with the Serbs of Kosovo. The problem lies in Belgrade, and the problem, as NATO general said, lies with one person who's called Slobodan Milosevic.
But President Milosevic has made it quite clear that he will not be bombed to the negotiating table. He will not give anything more to the Kosovo Albanians. He will not have a state within a state. And you have airstrikes. The two things aren't going to solve the problem, are they?
No, the intermediate status it was designed to be a status for 3 years, and it is not a state within the state. It is a autonomy within Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It's not something we have opted for.
But his concern is that it will be a state.
We have opted for independence. So, when you go on the negotiations, everybody makes some concessions. We had made lots of concessions. It was very difficult decisions from our side, especially knowing whatever the Serbian troops are doing to us, killing, massacring us on a daily basis. We have had to agree on living with them another 3 years, and then looking further after those 3 years. They have to make those concessions as well. You see, they are saying that they are being bombed by aggressors. We have to realize that these countries who have made the decision to attack Milosevic are the most democratic countries in the world, and they would not take a decision to go and massacre and wipe out the population.
Are you not concerned, though, that this is going to spread into a much wider Balkan conflict? We have some pictures we're just going to play now of some refugees who are crossing into Macedonia. This could escalate out of control in the Balkans.
I think NATO has the means to stop that. NATO is probably the most powerful alliance in history, and they have the means to stop the conflict of spreading. And I think that's why they did actually undertake these actions now, so the conflict would not spread around.
But it doesn't, does it? Because it doesn't have the ground troops on the ground at the moment. It has some troop presence in Macedonia, but it doesn't have a huge troop presence and not a big enough troop presence to stop this now.
Well, our view is that with or without Milosevic's agreement, troops have to come on the ground. That's the only long-lasting solution for the region.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. That was Byram Gesai of the Kosovo Crisis Committee here in London. And we'll have more on the developing situation today, special and a reminder of our main story this hour. NATO countries have stressed their determination to press ahead with military attacks on Serbia and its forces in Kosovo. The Secretary-General of NATO, Javier Solana, described last night's attacks as a success. He said all the NATO planes that took part were safe. The Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe, General Wesley Clark, said the airstrikes would continue as long as President Milosevic resisted demands to agree a peace settlement in Kosovo. There were more explosions earlier near the Serb capital Belgrade, with witnesses reporting clouds of smoke near a military airport and an aircraft factory. The Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe, General Wesley Clark, said military action would continue until President Milosevic decided to back down.
We're going to systematically and progressively attack, disrupt, degrade, devastate, and ultimately, unless President Milosevic complies with the demands of the international community, we're going to destroy these forces and their facilities and support. In that respect, the operation will be just as long and difficult as President Milosevic requires it to be.
Diplomats were dismissing Russian objections as largely rhetorical. But overnight in Moscow, protests outside the American, Italian and British embassies have degenerated into egg-throwing. The danger is NATO bombing could add power to the anti-Western voices of these Russian nationalists. NATO has started World War III, claims Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the infamous leader of the Liberal Democratic Party in Russia. Our Serb brothers will repeal the attack, he continues, and exterminate all NATO soldiers without mercy. Elsewhere in Moscow, a more measured tone, but still harsh condemnation of NATO came this morning from defense ministers of former Soviet republics. One of them, Belarus, has even suggested it might ask Russia to rearm it with nuclear missiles. But President Yeltsin this morning retreated from hints of military retaliation, limiting Russia's response so far to suspending cooperation with NATO and demanding emergency debate at the United Nations. The bombing prompted street protests in New York too, though here there were both anti-NATO and anti-Serb demonstrators. Inside the United Nations, an uncomfortable debate last night revealed a deeply split Security Council. NATO allies, of course, justified the action, but the Chinese joined Russia in calling the strikes, unsanctioned by the UN, unacceptable. The UN Secretary-General, Kofi Annan, also signalled his unhappiness.
It is indeed tragic that diplomacy has failed.
NATO says halting Kosovo's humanitarian crisis was reason enough to act, even without UN approval. But as refugees crowd on the border, the worry is bombing may have worsened the plight of those still inside Kosovo, and even draw neighbouring Macedonia into the war if Serbs decide to attack these NATO peacekeepers. Bridget Kendall, BBC News.
Jugoslawiens ambassador.
Vom Typ F-15 musste am Mittag in Sarajevo notlanden. Bei den bisherigen Angriffen wurden nach jugoslawischen Angaben 10 Menschen getötet und 38 verletzt. Die Toten seien ausnahmslos Zivilisten. Viele Menschen, wie hier in Belgrad, suchten während der Angriffe die Luftschutzräume auf.
Mit Beginn der NATO-Luftschläge hat die serbische Regierung ihren Terror gegen die Kosovo-Albaner massiv verschärft. In der Provinzhauptstadt Pristina sollen mehrere prominente Albaner exekutiert worden sein, berichtet ARD-Korrespondent Birdl. Ein Schriftsteller sowie ein Anwalt mit seinen Söhnen seien auf offener Straße erschossen worden.
Unklar ist die Lage an den Grenzen zu Mazedonien und die Situation der Flüchtlinge. Einerseits heißt es, die Übergänge seien geöffnet. Diese Bilder aber zeigen die Grenze geschlossen und menschenleer. Nicht einmal die offiziellen Hilfsorganisationen wissen, wo genau sich die mehr als 400.000 Flüchtlinge aus dem Kosovo aufhalten. Es wird vermutet, dass sie in den Wäldern Schutz suchen. Auf mazedonischem Gebiet an der Grenze zum Kosovo patrouillieren seit gestern Abend Panzer der NATO. Vergeltungsschläge von jugoslawischer Seite auf die NATO-Truppen werden befürchtet.
Der NATO-Militär.
But we're waiting for further developments in this assistance.
Russian and its allied defense chiefs also met today, but for now any enthusiasm for military action will hit the hard fact, understood equally by the White House and the Kremlin, that Russia still badly needs IMF financial support. State Department officials in Washington have said they anticipated and largely discounted this level of protest. But should the airstrikes continue for too long, then an already strained relationship strays into uncharted territory. And clearly Russia's leaders are being offered plenty of worrying suggestions about what they should do next. Andrew Wilson, Sky News in Moscow.
And Andrew Wilson joins
Not many more details on the letter, but I think it's interesting now that Boris Yeltsin, or indeed the Russian government, is being seen as the middleman between Slobodan Milosevic and the goings-on in the international community. He is the one ally they're depending on. His brother, Borislav Milosevic, who is the ambassador, Yugoslav ambassador in Moscow, has been very much of a high profile the last few days, drumming up support and also drumming up sympathy for Yugoslavia's plight and antagonism towards the West. It seems that Russia is the playground at the moment where perhaps Yugoslavia can find future allegiances and perhaps even some muscle to back up its situation. That's the dilemma, really, that Russia finds itself in now.
But a strange dilemma in that on the one hand this is happening, they're criticising NATO and not supporting airstrikes. On the other hand, I understand they are in fact meeting to ask the International Monetary Fund for yet more funds.
Yes, and that lends a whole element of stage management to the situation here. On the top levels, we've got Boris Yeltsin criticising the NATO forces for attacking, saying that they're violating everything the United Nations stand for, calling for an emergency meeting of the United Nations, condemning the bombing, and saying that Russia will rise above that, avoiding any talk of military action, but saying peacefully Russia's not happy with the situation. Below that, you've got the freelance radicals in the Russian Duma staging protests outside the embassy, staging queues of young men, so-called signing up to go and fight for the Yugoslavs on their own territory, and people calling for the reinstatement of nuclear weapons in Belarus, of the Ukrainian parliament saying that they should now become a nuclear state again because the peace of that area is being threatened. So all these things are going on at one level. Behind the scenes, the one man who seems to have disappeared is Yevgeny Primakov, the Prime Minister. He is the big negotiator with Michel Camdessou from the IMF, and he seems to have gone to ground, taking no part really in the goings-on at the moment, because he has to carry on with the business as usual, which is finding some money for Russia's ailing economy.
And some critics would say that Moscow is acting like the old superpower, even despite its diminished role on the world stage, acting out of suitable character now.
Joining us on the line from Podgorica, the capital down in Montenegro, is our Europe correspondent Arnott van Linden. Arnott, we're getting reports of air raid sirens going off again there. What more can you tell us?
That's right, Chris. Just about 10 minutes ago, the air raid sirens went off. It could be heard throughout Podgorica, the Montenegrin capital. It's the first time it's happened since the airstrikes began. The airstrikes, of course, hit also here in Montenegro last night at 8:15 local time, 7:15 British time, but no air raid sirens went off at that time. There was no warnings whatsoever. The airport was hit and 3 other military installations, radar centers, and the main air defense center, about 20 kilometers west of the Montenegrin capital. But this is the first time that the air raid sirens have actually gone on. However, since then, nothing has much changed on the streets as far as I can see it. From where I'm standing, there are still people walking out on the streets, there are people driving around. And generally, the reaction here has been much calmer than what we've heard has happened in Belgrade. There's been no
bunkers. Yugoslavia says 10 civilians have already been killed and dozens injured in the bombing attacks.
Just in, we're receiving information that says Italian Prime Minister Massimo D'Alema has said today to people gathered there in, I can't quite see where it is, at the European Union summit, yes, in Berlin. He's told people there that NATO airstrikes against Yugoslavia had stopped a Serb offensive in Kosovo, that NATO airstrikes against Yugoslavia had stopped a Serb offensive. He told reporters at the summit that the time for a diplomatic initiative on Kosovo was approaching and praised a Russian call for a meeting of the Big Power Contact Group in charge of Balkan diplomacy. We'll obviously try and bring you some more information from that about that as soon as we can.
Now, these are anxious.
Crew from the world's oldest air squadron flew out to the Gio del Colle air base in Italy as a routine posting last month. They now find themselves playing a key role in this latest conflict. The RAF say families of the service personnel on the Cambridgeshire base are receiving help and support from welfare officers. In the adjoining village, local people say the atmosphere is tense.
People are more pensive and worried, you know, about what might happen.
People don't really say very much about it, you know, it's all part of service life.
The squadron dates back to 1912, when it was number 1 Airship Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps. Number 1 Fighter Squadron was the first in the world to use the Harrier jump jet. They now have 8 of the latest generation of Harrier GR7s, currently based in Italy and very much involved in this latest conflict. So far, 6 of the GR7s have been in action. They carry 1,000 and 2,000 pound Paveway 2 and Paveway 3 bombs, which were used against the Iraqis in the Gulf War. They're also armed with Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. Back at the UK base, they're confidently waiting for the safe return of their pilots. David Crabtree, Sky News, RAF Wittering in Cambridgeshire.
Well, we've received hundreds of emails.
In response. At the moment, I've got almost 700 emails that we haven't had a chance to read yet. And this is just one of the email boxes that we have here at Sky News. We have about 4 or 5 for the different programmes, and this is just for the Your Call email box. And since the programme that Sheila presented about an hour ago, they've been coming in at the rate of like 4 or 5 a minute. Just to look at the first one I've got.
Të dashur mirëdita dhe mirëserët në programin shqip të Radios Gjermane, Deutsche Welle, gjatë aksioneve të mbrëmshme 7 aeroplan luftarak të NATO-s bombarduan pozicionet ushtarake serbe. Këto aksione u përshëndeten nga shumica vendeve të botës, post Rusisë dhe Kinës.